Okay, we're going to get started. And just as a reminder, if everyone can please mute their mics during the webinar, that'd be great. That would be greatly appreciated. Let's start my video. There we go. Okay, so welcome everybody. In today's webinar, we are going to see how we can utilize SVGs to animate text, and we're going to be using strictly HTML, CSS, and then just a very, very small amount of vanilla JavaScript. And so this is the project that we're going to be building. So if I hit refresh right here, you'll see that it starts drawing the text and then it starts coloring in the text. And so this would be something that would be incredibly tricky, if not impossible to do without leveraging SVGs. And so before we get started, I want to just kind of give a high level view of what an SVG is, which will kind of help you understand what we're going to be implementing, what we're going to be working with. So an SVG is a HTML element. It's a tag that allows us to essentially draw on the screen. So many times that when you encounter SVGs, you'll be seeing them implemented with different shapes. And also you will see things like logos being created in SVGs. They are vector graphics that allow you to actually reach in and perform various tasks. So in this case, we're going to be drawing an SVG with text, and then we're also going to be coloring in that text. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this guide. There are a couple key elements that I want you to just kind of keep in the back of your mind, because we're going to be using them. And if you've never heard of these terms before, it might be a little bit confusing, but we'll take our time and go through that. So here is an example from the documentation of a SVG tag. And one of the key things in an SVG is the view box. So in order to understand how to create SVGs, you have to think about how a X and Y graph plane works. So if you think about the SVG right here in our example, we have this entire element is an SVG. And so the way that you can implement the type of drawing behavior and coloring behavior that we're going to do is we're actually going to think of this as being inside or on top of a graph. So when we want to work with the horizontal axis, then we're going to be using the x-axis, and then vertically we're going to be using y. So you're going to see as we write out the code that we're going to be using these coordinates, and that is how the tag is going to know exactly where to be placed. And so don't worry if you've never done anything like this before. We're going to take our time and go through that. So that's the view box. And then you'll also see inside of the SVG, we have some other elements. And that is how you're able to define what values are going to be there. So in this case, in the documentation, they are drawing a circle. In ours, we're actually going to be able to use a text element. So I'll bring that one up. So right here, you can see that you can actually create a text tag inside of the SVG, and that's what we're going to be utilizing in ours. But as you go through your development career, you'll notice that most of the time you're using other tags like clip path, which we'll also be using, and some other elements. So if you've ever worked with icons or anything like that, typically those are SVGs that are drawn, and that's what allows them to scale up and scale down to any size and still keep their aspect ratio and still keep their resolution. So that is what we're going to be building. I placed in the chat, and if you're watching this and it's recorded, I'll place it in the show notes, to the GitHub repo. You have two branches, master and starter. Master is the final version. Starter is the starter one. As with all of these webinars, my recommendation is not to follow along the first time that you are watching it, but instead just to watch and see exactly what I'm doing. And then afterwards, then begin on the starter branch where you can pull this down and clone this repo. And then you can build this out yourself. And that's a really good way to learn it. So let's get started. I'm going to shrink this down and we are going to switch over to that starter branch. So I'm going to say git checkout starter. So now we're going to have the basic version of it. So if I hit refresh now, you'll see that I'm just using regular text content. So this is my HTML right here. I just have a class called content text, and then I have these three divs. We're going to be getting rid of these, and we're going to see how we can implement this using our SVGs. So that's what we're going to get started with. So I'm going to start off by creating an SVG tag. And then inside of this SVG tag, very similar to the documentation, we're first going to define a view box. So I'm just going to say view box, and then these are going to be the coordinates that we're going to set. So we're going to have 0, 0, 200, and then 140. Now, out of everything, the whole coordinate plane system that SVGs use, if you've never used them before, that's typically one of the most confusing things to students. I know it was for me when I was originally learning how to work with them. So also in the show notes, I'll place in a link to this helpful article that I found. And this is defining the view box, and it talks about how the whole coordinate system works. So like right here, you can see we defined a view box of 0, 0, 200, and 140. And once again, can everyone please be on mute so that we don't have any other audio coming in? So right here, you can see each one of these values maps directly in the view box. So the X, which we talked about, is that horizontal value. That's going to be 0, which means we are starting on the left-hand side. And then Y is going to be 0, which means we're starting at the top. And then the width, in our case, is 200. And then our height is 140. So that is that view box that we're creating. And as you'll see, as we go through and build out each one of these text elements, we're going to be referencing where that text should appear inside of that view box. So let's get started with that. So inside of the SVG, well, we're also going to add a class so that we can select it. So for this one, I'm just going to call it headline. And now inside of the SVG, this is where we're going to start creating our text tags. So we're going to work with a text tag. And then inside of that, let me actually just close it off first. And now inside of this, this is where our text is going to go. So the first one is let's. Now inside of the text tag itself, we're going to add some properties. The first one is going to be the text anchor property. And then that's going to have a name. And inside of here, we're just going to call it animated-text-anchor. And then after that, we're going to define our coordinates for this piece of text. So for this one, it's going to start at 10 to the left. And then for the Y coordinate, it's going to start at 35. So once again, that's why I brought up that graph at the beginning, because this is something that if you've never seen it before, it can be a little bit confusing. But once you understand that the SVGs map directly, just like on a graph, then it starts to make some more sense. Then after that, we're going to add in a class. I'm going to call it text and text-stroke. And then lastly, and this is very important, this would not work without this, we're going to define a clip-path. And then inside of here, this part can look a little confusing. We're going to pass in a URL, then a hash symbol, and then we're going to just call this one text1. So what this is going to do is anytime in HTML you see this little hash symbol, it's usually a good rule of thumb that this is going to map directly to an ID. And that is what it's going to do. This text tag by itself does not have an ID, but you're going to see in a little bit that this is going to map directly. And this is how the entire clip path in the SVG is going to be structured. So we're going to create that first one, and then we're just going to replicate this. So we're going to have let's, the next one is start. You can have yours obviously say whatever you want to spell out. The text anchor is going to be the same. Now this X coordinate, because as you noticed, we want start to be down some. And so we're going to have the X coordinate remain the same, but the Y is going to change. The Y is going to be at 80. And then for this class is also going to be the same text and then text stroke. And once we get to the CSS implementation, you'll see what this is doing. And then lastly, this clip path is no longer going to reference that ID of text1. Instead, it's going to be text2. And then we're going to replicate this and put in our third one. So now we'll say coding, and animated text anchor here will be the same. X coordinate will be the same. And then here we're going to move it down because we're in the Y coordinate. And for this one, I'm going to put 125. And then text stroke is going to be the same. Now the clip path, as you may have already guessed, is going to point to text3. So these are the initial text tags. But as you're about to find out, in order to get this working, we have a few different steps. So if you remember when I showed you exactly what the final version was, this starts off just showing a blank page. Then it draws the SVG. Then it colors it in. So we actually have 3 separate steps that we need to implement, which means we're going to have to create multiple versions of these text tags. So just for the sake of time, I'll copy and paste these. And then we'll just change each one of these. So the let's one right here, it's going to have the same animated text anchor. This is like the base text anchor. And we're still going to be at 10 and 35. We're not going to have to change our coordinates because these SVGs are going to remain in the same place. But we are going to change the class name. So starting at let's, we're going to start with text. Then after that, we're going to have text stroke, just like we have, but then we're going to add in another one. So here we're going to say text dash stroke and then -2. And then this is going to remain the same for these other ones. So we'll do the same thing here. And then the same thing here. The clip path remains the same for each of them because each one is going to be pointing to that ID. So that is our second set of them. And then let me verify, just look at my notes, make sure I'm not missing anything. Nope, that all looks good. So we have our first 2 groupings. Now it's time for us to define what are called our defs. And once again, I wanted to make sure that because usually, if this is usually the first time that someone is studying this, so I brought in the documentation, and I'll share this in the show notes as well for that. So the defs is another tag, and you can think of them as like definitions for the SVG. And as you read it right here, defs is an element used to store graphical objects that will be used at a later time. So what we did first was we defined those text elements. Now we're going to actually define the clip paths and how we want these elements to be rendered. So let's move on to that. And now we're going to create our defs list. So right below our second grouping, I'm going to define defs. And then inside of here, we're going to start with our clip path. So clip and then path, just like this. Now you're going to see where we set these IDs. So the first one's going to be text1. And then, as you might have noticed, this is mapping directly here. So if you're wondering where that ID is going to be, we're pointing to the URL and then text 1 for the ID. And this is where that ID can be found. So we have our clip path. And then lastly, we just need to put in another text component. And for that, let me just copy. I'm going to copy each one of these, or let's just copy the first one just to make it nice and easy. So inside of this first clip path, we're going to have our text anchor. And this is once again going to say animated text anchor. The X and Y coordinates are going to be the same because this is where we're drawing on that coordinate plane. And then for a class, we're just going to say text. And then this one does not have a clip path because this clip path is actually what we're defining now. So I'm going to, let's replicate this. So we have our clip path for text 2. I'm going to close it off. And then let's also do 3. And now we can replicate each one of these. So here, animated text anchor, but this is for our second grouping. So our coordinates are going to change slightly. This one needs to be 80. Class is text, and this text is going to say start. And then let's do the same thing right here. So I'll replicate this. And then this coordinate plane is going to map to 1, 2, 5. And it's going to say coding. Okay, so let's see. Right now, there's still going to be some extra work we have to do, but let's just see if everything blew up or what it looks like right now. So that's pretty cool. So right now, without us doing anything, it says, let's start coding. This is no longer a regular set of text elements. These are now SVGs. So if you inspect this in the browser console, you can see what is being created. So no longer do we just have some divs with the text in there. Now, technically what's happening is we're actually picking out where we want text to be drawn. And then from there, we are using SVGs to do all of this for us. So you can see there's our view box. That's how we've defined what that coordinate plane is going to look like. And then inside of here, we're now drawing the text tags. We're no longer placing them inside of divs. So now what we're able to do is we're able to select these values and then do something with them. So in our case, we're going to do some animated drawing and then coloring in. So let's close this out and open up our SAS or CSS file. And for this, I'm going to bring over the actual styles because you do not want to watch me type each one of these in because it's about 80 lines of code. So I'm just going to paste these in for my notes and we're going to walk through what's happening. Okay, so we're first selecting the SVG tag. So right at the very top here, we are saying find the SVG tag, and then from there, we want to select the headline. So if you're familiar and you've done the CSS class, then you'll know that by putting the dot there, we're saying grab the SVG that has the class of headline. And in our case, we are simply saying we want to add a width of 80 VW, which is saying that whatever the screen size is, we want it to take up 80% of that viewport width. Then from there, we're starting this off by saying display none. So we're saying that when you grab the headline, look for a class inside of it of text. So we're going to find every spot where we have text, and we're actually starting off by saying don't show anything. because if you remember our final version and what it's supposed to do, we want it to start off blank before we start the drawing process. So that's the first part. We say, don't show anything at first. Then we're going to grab the text animation class. So you can find text animation, and that is going to be that's going to simply give us the ability right here to define a font family, which I defined up here. If you took the webinar where we had the variables, the CSS variables, and you'll remember the way that you can call these is by saying var and then dash dash inside of parens and putting the name of whatever variable you're wanting to work with. So this one's called sans, which is what we defined right up here. And then I did the same thing for 3 of our colors just to make it a little bit easier so we're not having to copy and paste that hexadecimal code in there. And so just moving down, fill is a very important property when it comes to SVGs. Fill is essentially, if you're used to CSS and you grab your text, usually you'll say color and then provide a value. You can think of fill functioning kind of the same way. Stroke is going to be the outline. So we're going to start off by saying we want to have a stroke of this highlight color, which is this dark hexadecimal color that we have right here. And so that's what we're going to be starting off by drawing, is by saying, I want you to fill in nothing, and I want the stroke color to be what we've defined here. And then from there, we're defining a stroke width and then some dash offset values. This part, I don't want you to really get caught up in everything in terms of what the dash offset's doing. This is essentially what's helping us make it look like that element is being drawn on the screen. And if you want, definitely you can dive into it a little bit more. Just copy one of these values and search through the documentation, and you'll be able to see exactly what it's doing. One of the important things here is animation. So animation is what is allowing the entire element to look like it's being drawn on. And so we defined a dash animation, and it is, let's just create this dash animation right here. And so the way you can define an animation in CSS is by saying keyframes, and then we're going to call this one dash. It's not going to take in any arguments or anything like that. And we're just going to say at 100% value, we want this to be the stroke dash offset, and we want to set this to 0. So what this is doing is it's allowing us to set whatever we want for that dash offset and to animate it. So coming back right here, we're starting with fill none, and then the dash offset starts off with a negative number. We're saying that when this animation runs, and it's going to take 3 seconds to run, we're saying dash 3 seconds, ease in and out, and then we want it to run forwards. This is a way you can call an animation and set those values. And after we run this and we make sure it's all working, then I'm going to come back here and show you how some of the changes can affect exactly how it gets rendered. Then from there, we're saying that we want that text stroke for the nth child 2, and then right below it 3. We actually want to change these values, because if you remember how the elements are being drawn on the screen, remember it starts with the top one, then it goes to the second one, and then the third one. What we're saying here is you can actually define when you want those to run by using animation delay, which is pretty cool, because then you can select the elements like here, the second and then the third one, and then you can say exactly the order and the time that you want them to run. So if you didn't have these values in here, what it would mean is that everything would simply be drawn all at the same time. but we're wanting to mimic and almost kind of make it look like it's being drawn like it would if you had a pen or something like that. Now here, we're changing the color. So we started off by saying that our stroke was going to be var highlight, which is that dark color. Now we're saying that we want to then move it onto the primary value. So if you come back and look at all of our tags, remember that we started with text stroke for the class for these first three. Then when you come down to the next ones, we switched and we added a class of text stroke 2. So what we're doing here is this is where the magic happens for saying that we want to change that stroke color. And then we're also adding an animation delay. This is what we're saying after the other animation is run. Now we want to wait 1.25 seconds. And then we want to draw in that second color. And then we're applying the same type of delay to the 5th and 6th child elements. So if you're curious on why we have to have these almost identical text tags, it's because we're needing to select each one of these values and then apply different styles to each one of them. And so that is pretty much it for the CSS. So I'm going to save this. And then we have one other thing that we have to add, which is a little tiny bit of JavaScript. So in the HTML, and this is going to be, I think we can go below the body with this one. We can create a script tag. And now we can write some vanilla JavaScript. So I'm going to say document.add event listener. And then we're going to want to go with DOM content loaded, and then pass in a function where we're going to grab the event. And then inside of curly brackets here, we're going to say what we want to happen, which is document.query selector. And inside of the selector, we want to select the class. So I'm going to say headline, and then class list. And then we want to add in text animation. Okay, so if you're curious on how we didn't have the class name anywhere here of class animation, so say I copy this and I search for it, there's no other spot where text animation is there. But if you look at our styles and you search for it here, you'll see that we have text animation in this class in multiple spots. So what we're doing with this JavaScript code here is we're saying that when the DOM is loaded, which means essentially when the page loads, we want to run this function, and we're going to grab the headline class, and then we are going to add in, and I forgot one little thing here, class list.add. We're going to add in text animation. So we're going to say, wherever you find this headline class, we want to add in a new class dynamically called text animation. Then that's going to just slide in to each one of those elements. So let's hit save here. And let's see if this is working. There we go. That is all working beautifully. So you now have everything you need in order to create and draw your own animated and colorized SVGs. Now, as I promised, I think it is, especially because we have some time, I wanted to come and change a few of these values so you can see exactly what they do. Because whenever I'm learning something new, this is one of the ways that it really helps me to understand what's happening behind the scenes. Because whenever you decide to build this type of functionality into the project, you're probably not going to have this identical use case. You're probably going to have some variations on it. So let's see what we could change here. So starting off, let's change each one of these values that say 35. Like, let's change these. So each one of these say 5. So everywhere where it says 35, just change that. Hit save. And now if you hit refresh, there you go. You'll see that this is actually moved up on the coordinate plane. And so now it's actually outside of the view box. And so that shows that our Y coordinate, where it's placing the elements vertically. So I'm going to switch each one of those back, hit save, and we are going to be back. So that is showing, hopefully, the way that that whole coordinate plane works. Now we can also change some of these other values like the animation. So what if I change this from 3 seconds to half a second? So now if I come back, hit refresh, you'll see it slides everything in super fast. You can barely even tell it's drawing, which is a reason why I went with 3 seconds. And then you can also change these animation delays. So like say that I hid some of these delays here. Now you hit refresh and there we go. So those ones, it's only a half-second difference. So it's kind of hard. It's a subtle little delay, but I think that it adds a nice little effect to add some different steps there. And then like say you wanted to change the color. So instead of stroke primary, say you wanted to change this so it was, red or something like that, hit refresh. And now you'll see that that is how you would change the color that's being set in there. And for this delay, say you wanted the drawing to happen faster, we could change this to just be 0.25, so a quarter of a second. Now you hit refresh and you can see that it almost starts coloring in right away. I'm going to swap those back. And those are some of the main things. So that is, well, one last thing. Let's see what happens if we remove display none here. So right there, display none. And that's not really changing things a terrible amount, but that is there just so that we know exactly where that it is starting. So I definitely recommend for you, when you pull the code down, play with each one of these values and see exactly how you'd want to change each one for your own use case. So one thing that I have seen, and I've actually done this on some of my own projects, is say that for start, say that I wanted to actually change this value. Let's change each one of the starts to 30. So start right here. And you may guess what this is going to do. So now hit refresh. And you'll see that now we've actually been able to move where that shows up. And that is something that for some of my own projects, I have had to do, because you may not always want these all lined up exactly like that. So anytime that you need to change the positioning of where those elements are showing up, like say that you wanted to have let's be right here, the second line be in the middle and coding all the way to the right, then that's where you'd be doing that. And that my undo went back a little bit far, so I'll change that. And now we're back to the final version. So does anybody have any questions about this or just coding in general? If you do, place them inside of the chat and I will answer them as best as I possibly can. And while we're waiting for any questions, a couple little common things that that are gotchas, things that I've had to deal with when building this into my own projects is you have to be specific about the type of font that you're using. Some of the times where I've used some, say, wider, bolder type fonts, it can be a little bit tricky because when it's drawing those elements, sometimes it doesn't actually handle things like the text borders perfectly, and you can have some things that just don't really show up properly. So if you ever are implementing this and you don't like the way it's looking at the font that you're using might be a good first place to start. And so I would definitely kind of keep that in mind. And so a question from Stewart, can the order be changed in which the animations appear? Yes, they can. So the animation delay is where all of that's happening. So say that you wanted to switch it up and say you wanted it to go in reverse or something like that, then what you could do is select the nth child of 1. And then from there, you can have the animation delay, say, set to 1 second. Then the nth child of 3, and then 6 also, you can set that one to 0, and then 2 could be the same. And then that would reverse the order, because all that's really happening here, the reason why they're coming up in this order is simply because we're defining that animation delay. Jordy put in, isn't it better to have a file do the animation instead of the code itself? And what would the difference be? So there are a couple key reasons why you'd want to do this. And this kind of goes to, and it's a good question because it goes to the question on why you would want to use SVGs. And they're not going to be for every single situation. So you could definitely use other forms of animation. So using SVG is kind of one of the most common ones. Another reason why you'd want to use an SVG is, say you need an element that will not lose its resolution whenever the viewport grows. So like in this case, notice what happens. See how it grows easily. So where this is really common is with icons and logos. So if you've looked at like some of the giant companies, a lot of times if you try to inspect their logo and you expect to get an image, you might be surprised because many times you will inspect it and it's an SVG. And so what that means is that to draw out essentially their logo, even if they're not using animations. And the reason for that is because they're able to control the way that that element gets rendered. And so in this case, it's kind of the same thing. So as far as putting it in another file, that would be tricky with HTML because HTML doesn't have the concept of imports. If I was building this, say, in React, I would definitely put it in a different file because I would make this in, and that's what I've done in the past, is I would make something like this into its own dedicated React component, and then I would pull it in whenever I needed it. Another thing, another really popular way of using animations, React provides a number of them. Lottie files is a way that you can actually search for animations here. So like say search for like house or something like that. They actually provide animations that are in a JSON file. So you can download a JSON file and then you need to have some way of rendering it. So there's some libraries that can render it. But essentially how these work is they take all of the JSON code, and you have a few other options like making it a GIF or something like that. But say you're doing it for, kind of the standard way of doing it, it actually gives you this giant file of JSON code, and each one of these values maps to how an animation can be generated. And so that's another, that whenever I have to build an animation, it kind of depends on the use case. Everyone is going to be unique. So depending on what has to be drawn on the screen, that is how I personally will kind of decide how to do it. One of the things I've done in the past was I needed to build out a native icon library. And so I couldn't use Font Awesome, couldn't use React icons, I couldn't use any outside library. And so what I did was I built out a giant file, and then I created my own set of SVG values. And so I'm pretty sure I can actually pull that up pretty quickly here. And then I can show you kind of an example of how that looks like. So I'm on my other screen. And looks like some other good questions are coming in. We have time. I will get to all of them, I promise. So yeah, this is good. I'll bring this entire file in. So this is a good example of other times that you're going to want to use a SVG. So this is a JavaScript library, so icons.ts. Okay, so what is happening here is I created a giant object, and this is in TypeScript. Look the same, completely the same if it was in vanilla JavaScript, where each key contained the attributes for the SVG. So like you had this little address book icon here. This has the view box values. So as we already covered, we're saying that we want this one to start at 0 and then 0. So starting in the top left-hand corner, and then we want it to be a square. So 24 by 24. And then here, we're not using the text attribute because each one of these are images. Then I simply brought in these path values, which is a giant string, but SVGs have the ability to take path values and then render them out accordingly. So and this was for a React project, so whenever you called this address book, it would slide in whatever the view box value is. And then from there, it would slide in these path attributes. And these, if you go back through the documentation links for SVGs, these are how the SVG knows how to render. So each one of these little elements is drawing a certain shape. And so if you go and you look at any of the major icon libraries, pretty much all of them are set up like this, where they have a giant object that has each one of these values, the view box, and then the path. And then that way, when the SVG is called, it knows exactly how to be drawn. Like in our case, we drew text, so we were able to use the text tag. Here, we're passing in path values, and these are drawing lines. So hopefully that helps answer that question. Also gives you an idea of kind of when you're pulling in an icon library, what's happening behind the scenes. Okay, Dr. Lucy asked a question of what can you do with styling text using SVGs that you cannot do using CSS to style text? That's another great question. And really the only real thing is essentially what we just implemented. And in fact, it's harder to style text in SVGs because you have to define all other kinds of rules as you just saw. So, a text element or a text tag doesn't have the ability to use things like changing those values the way you normally would with a standard text tag, because you have to think about the changes and how they're going to affect the coordinate plane. So you can't use the same exact type hover effects or those kinds of things. So the only time that you would ever choose to use a text tag in an SVG is when you're wanting to do pretty much exactly what we just did. If one, if you want a text element to scale up and down no matter the screen size and never really lose its size, value, resolution, or those kinds of things. But then also, if you want to do things like drawing them, because that would be incredibly hard. I mean, technically, it's impossible to do it exactly like we did, just with pure vanilla CSS. And so, yeah, so it's what we just built out is not going to be something that you build out for every single project that you do. But when you do need to build that out, it's very helpful to have this kind of tool in your arsenal. And then also the thing that I really want you to kind of take away from this is understanding how SVGs work, because it will be quite common in your projects where you're going to have to implement this. So some of the most common examples that I personally have are things like I mentioned with building out an icon library. Then also say that, and this is a really common one that I've had, say that some client gives you a SVG value and it's not in any, it's an icon that's not in any libraries. So it's not in Font Awesome, it's not in any of these other ones. You are going to have to build out your own. And I remember when I first started working with SVGs years ago, I had all kinds of struggles trying to get the SVG I was working with to show up properly, mainly because I didn't understand the view box. Because that took me a while to understand how the view box defined kind of that coordinate plane and how I could position those elements. I constantly was having the icons and the logos I was building be cut off, and it all came from how the view box was working. So that is one of the big takeaways that I want you to have. Stuart asked a question of, can SVGs be used with mixins? And yes, absolutely. So, and yeah, I mean, this kind of goes for any kind of Sass styles. A good example would be, say you were writing this in Sass, you could actually have all of this behavior inside of a mixin. So you could have something like, and this is not a Sass file. Let me open up a Sass file. So you could have something like this, where you have like animated text as a mixin. You could pass in some arguments if you wanted to, and then pretty much all of the elements inside of it, they would all be able to be available to you. So you could put all of these values inside of a mixin, and then from there you could just call include, or create some some class, and then inside of it just say include whatever I called that, animated text, just like that. And then you don't have to, copy and paste those styles, and you can use them in any parent class or anything like that. So yes, you can. Additionally, you could add in arguments. So like say that you wanted the seconds, like the second delay to be dynamic or something, you could pass in those arguments. And then here for the animation, you could have the second delay passed in and be dynamic so that anytime you want some slightly different behavior, you could do that. You could also have it so you had second delay, and you could change the color so that the start color or something, instead of being that black, could be something like this. So yeah, mixins are something, and if you're using SAS, you'd be able to streamline a lot of this code as well, because you wouldn't have to do all of this weird detailed nesting and all of that kind of thing. Those are all really good questions today. Proud of you guys for asking all of those. So if there are no other ones, I want to thank every one of you for your time, and I hope you got a lot out of this. I hope you'll be able to, one, understand the way SVGs work, and so that you can use them on your own projects. And then also, anytime you need to have something like this, where you animate and color in text elements, then you'll have code that you can pretty much copy and paste right into those projects, and then have each one of those just built right in. So great job in going through that today, and I will see everybody next month.